in the HFA 2, which is the private sector role, public and private partnership for disaster risk reduction. My name is Kenichi Suganuma. I'm the ambassador in charge of the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be held in Sendai, Japan, next year in March. Let me introduce the plenary today. The topic I mentioned will be treated by the panel discussion later, and then followed by the plenary discussion. Before beginning the panel discussion, let me have a presentation back from previous session, including the high-level roundtable, the HFA2 plenary 3 and technical session 3 that took place just a moment ago. So first, let me briefly summarize what happened in the high-level roundtable 3, which just finished a moment ago. We have heard statements from many countries, starting from Kyrgyzstan, Qatar, Timor-Leste, Turkmenistan, Australia, Bahrain, Cambodia, Japan, Republic of Korea, Mongolia, Oman, and the United States of America. We have heard the country national actions, experience, commitments, and the progress that they have made under the HFA. All delegates recognize that the Hyogo Framework of Action is a basic international instrument for the DRR implementation. There was strong support to the view that the post-development agenda, post-2015 development agenda, must be linked with post-2015 framework for the DRR, as well as the outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit and climate change agreements. We noted that there were recommendations on the need for governments to engage in private sector in disaster risk reduction, and this is one of the themes that we are treating here. It was recognized that resilience can only be achieved if all sectors of societies are involved. It was also highlighted that building resilience to disasters is a priority condition for sustainable economic development and growth. The need to prioritize the strengthening of local resilience, community participation, multi-stakeholder cooperation, and to continue awareness development, knowledge development, and sharing learning experience was also emphasized. There were several concrete recommendations about what should be contained in the post-HFA framework. And I noted some recommendation about the need for a human security approach, the need to strengthen people-centered DRR efforts, the need to enhance comprehensive risk assessments, improve science-based risk information for decision-making, the need to invest in disaster risk reduction and structural measures, the notion of building back better, and to establish reliable disaster statistics as key areas to be addressed in the post-HFA framework. With that, let me move on to the report about the HFA2 plenary by Mr. Andrew Muscri. Andrew Muscri, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Your Excellency, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We've just had a 2-hour meeting on how to improve the system for monitoring progress under the post-2015 framework. I'm going to highlight 7 points, which I think came out of the meeting quite strongly. I think there was point number 1, there was a consensus on the need to build on and improve the existing HFA monitor, which is the government self-assessment instrument we're currently using to measure progress on the HFA. I think there was also a consensus on the need to move from just measuring our inputs into disaster risk reduction, such as new laws or codes or policies, to the measurement of outputs and ultimately outcomes. In other words, whether disaster losses and impacts are actually going up or down. We also discussed the importance of linking to the Sustainable Development Goals and to the framework on climate change. But we also stressed that while comparable, objective, global indicators of progress are important, the monitoring framework has to be appropriate to the reality, the multiple realities at the national and the local level. We have to have a system which is appropriate to developed countries, to developing countries, to large countries, to small islands, to countries with multiple high risks and countries with lower risks, and countries with very, very different legislative and administrative arrangements. We also feel that the monitoring system needs to be useful and needs to provide tools to the local and national officials in charge of disaster risk management to help them do their job better. Ultimately, it has to be useful at that level. We believe that to develop the indicators that are being proposed, we need to leverage to the maximum new advances in science, in data, in remote sensing, and information technology. There's a major contribution which these areas can make. We feel that an improved monitoring framework can also facilitate accountability in disaster risk management through diverse means, such as countries preparing national reports to their parliaments, or through the action of national audit and controllers' bodies. We believe that the implementation of an improved monitoring framework will have to be progressive. It's not something that can be implemented overnight, and we'll have to build from a baseline, which we will have to put in place soon after the adoption of a new framework in Sendai next year. And last but not least, we feel this is going to require a major capacity building effort at all levels, at the local level and at the national level, to put into place a capacity building effort that is going to require a series of years' work to make the system work fully, but which countries really feel they're going to need. We're talking about capacity building, not just for monitoring, but ultimately for disaster risk management itself. So, Mr. Chair, with those points, I will finish my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me move on to the report about the session, technical session 3 by Mr. Eduardo Batak. Mr. Batak, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Suganuma. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Technical Session 3, I am pleased to report the result of discussions that have taken place in this room, as well as the outcome of 10 private sector-related events. The discussions indeed confirmed the key roles played by the private sector as engines of economic growth, major investors, and employment generators. The private sector determines the society's resilience. Hence, the private sector must be fully engaged in disaster risk reduction. The series of discussions have made it quite evident that disaster risk reduction requires multi-sector partnerships between governments, civil society organizations, academic and research institutions, and businesses. The following are the resultant key messages. 1. On what the private sector should do to become more resilient and at the same time contribute to the society's resilience. Point number 1. The post-2015 Disaster Risk Reduction Framework of HFA2 should reaffirm the important role, responsibility, and accountability of the private sector in disaster risk management. The private sector should establish disaster risk management reference groups or task forces within existing structures and mechanisms. This could be through business advisory councils at the regional level, chambers of commerce, and associations at the national level and local levels. Point number 2, private sector should shift their business paradigm from response-oriented activities to risk-sensitive and responsible business investments to avoid the creation and accumulation of risk, and from relief charity to shared values. Private sector should actively incorporate risk-sensitive considerations into their business processes. Point number 3, the HFA2 should promote the protection of the global value chains from disaster risks. Private sector should develop business continuity plans, particularly for the highly integrated supply chains, to manage the higher spillover of risk arising from the rapid expansion and integration of trades and economies. 2. On what governments should do to create an enabling environment that facilitates and incentivizes the engagement of the private sector in disaster risk reduction. Under this, point 1, government should improve, establish, and enforce regulatory frameworks such as building codes, land use plans, and safety standards in order to increase accountability. Government should provide monetary and non-monetary incentives to facilitate, guide, and support investments in disaster risk management. This includes tax deductions, subsidies for disaster risk reduction investments, and setting of resilience standards in public tenders. Point 3, governments should facilitate the easy access to disaster risk information to businesses, particularly the SMEs, at a low cost. This could be through existing information and promotion channels in agencies that are in direct contact with entrepreneurs and investors. 4, governments in collaboration with and as appropriate, complemented by civil society organizations and larger or multinational corporations should provide special supports to micro, small, and medium enterprises, which constitute the backbone of the economy. 6, governments should support the insurance sector to increase availability and affordability of disaster risk transfer products, particularly through public-private partnerships. On the question, what forms of partnership and collaboration between businesses and other stakeholders can be effective in promoting resilience? 1, public-private partnerships in their various forms that help increase the efficiency of the government's delivery of goods and services should be broadened to facilitate the active involvement of private sector in disaster risk reduction. Partnership between business and civil society organizations should be encouraged to recast the corporate social responsibility practices from their traditional response-oriented into risk reduction, focusing on prevention, mitigation, and preparedness, and creating shared value. 3, multi-stakeholder platforms at the regional, national, and local levels should be promoted in order to increase mutual understanding and to broaden the accountability circles. Multi-stakeholders, thematic dialogues in the existing regional and national events, such as the Asia-Pacific Business Forum, should be held on a regular basis. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, we cannot envision a resilient society without resilient businesses. To that end, the private sector must stand up and be counted as a major component in the post-2015 disaster risk reduction framework. Thank you and good day.
Thank you, Mr. Batak, with the report with specific recommendations. So, with all these 3 reports in mind, let us move to the panel discussion. As moderator, let me introduce Ambassador Philip Gibson. Ambassador Philip Gibson is the New Zealand Special Envoy for Disaster Risk Management and led the ministry's response to the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. He also has a very good understanding in the region with many years of diplomatic experience, including as ambassador to Indonesia, ASEAN, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So with that, I will invite Ambassador Gibson to come as moderator. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. What I'd like to do immediately is to invite very distinguished members of this panel to join us here. and then I'd like to introduce them briefly. So first, could Ms. Annie Garcia please come? No, in fact, I'll speak now. Annie is the president of SM Supermalls, with 49 malls across the Philippines, as well as 5 branches in China. SM Supermalls is owned by SM Prime Holdings Incorporated, now one of the leading property developers in Southeast Asia, and an active member of the UNISDR Private Sector Partnership Advisory Group. Thank you, Annie. I'd also like to call Mr. Mike Rothery. Mike heads the National Security Resilience Policy Division in Australia's Attorney General's Office, where he is responsible for delivering policy advice related to developing natural resilience to natural and human-made disasters. Mike? I now have great pleasure in introducing Ms. Sandra Wu. Sandra is Kokusai Kogyo's chairperson and CEO. She is also chair of the UNISDR Private Sector Advisory Group, where she has been an active member since April 2011, raising awareness in the role businesses can play in disaster risk reduction. Annie. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Ms. Fatimath Tasnim. She is the Deputy Minister, Ministry of Defence and National Security, directly responsible for national disaster risk management programs, and she has been working in the area of disaster management since 2005. And finally, I like to call Ms. Gaëlle Olivier. Gaëlle is the Chief Executive Officer for the General Insurance Business at AXA Asia, based at the regional head office in Singapore. Gaëlle oversees all general insurance operations in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as in Hong Kong, China, and India. We have a distinguished grouping here, and I'd like to kick off immediately, and Deputy Minister Fatimath, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to you to start and ask, how can we strengthen the role of the private sector in disaster risk reduction?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair and the moderator. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Particularly answering the question, I would like to brief you on a program we started recently in Maldives. It is called the Resilient Resort Program. This is an initiative by the government to pave a platform for both parties, public and private sector, to understand the needs and contribute the needs in the field of disaster management. Given the need for the support to the tourism industry to build the resilience and capacity to respond to disasters, the National Disaster Management Center has collaborated with Maldives National Defence Force to formulate a technical support program which would cover aspects of emergency preparedness and response in tourist resorts. It is a prime example of collaboration between national stakeholders. Now, we are talking about a sector that contributes 30% directly and 70% indirectly to our GDP. Maldives follows a one island, one resort concept. All the resort islands are vastly scattered in the ocean. This poses huge logistical challenges of accessibility in responding to emergencies. Some resort islands are isolated from the National Response Force, and the quickest response comes always locally. There is increase in demand from local governance and communities for developing their capacity and preparedness to respond to emergencies. This includes technical capacity, institutional arrangements, and access to equipment and tools. This is true to the communities and the resorts together as well. The Resilient Resort Program is a program that facilitates the resort management to build awareness and capacities, to develop disaster preparedness and response mechanisms in the resorts. The preparedness component includes identification of hazards and vulnerabilities in the resorts. And also, we conduct resource analysis and training needs analysis of the resorts. The response component develops an incident command for response, coordination and communication mechanisms, identification of priority response areas, detailed standard operating procedures for emergencies for all departments of the resort. We also conduct multi-hazard evacuation plans to test the program that we conduct in the resorts. The program clubs with training on fire safety and maritime safety, and each program concludes with a simulation drill of a local emergency to which the resort staff responds using the skills, tools, and mechanisms that have been developed. The objective is to enhance the capacity of resort to manage local emergencies and establish and equip a local response force on the resort islands that can respond to emergencies in a planned and coordinated manner. The pilot program was implemented in one of the resorts in March to April 2014, followed by a hotel in an urban setting. The program was well received by both the management. With the experience gained from local context and the business perspectives, the program design is being further strengthened with the feedback from the resorts. Currently, there are 4 resorts and hotels in the pipeline, and we expect more resorts to become part of the Resilient Resort Program in the near future. The model is designed for the private sector to provide in-kind contributions to strengthen disaster preparedness of our island communities or strengthen response capacities of our response forces. This increases their credibility as a development partner, enables them to give back to the community, and also ensures the safety of the communities. For the communities, receiving even something simple such as a pump to drain the flood during the flood season goes a long way in enabling them to respond to disasters and mitigate their losses. A small investment from the private sector that goes a long way for public safety. Public-private partnership is a new avenue with a huge potential that we can tap for disaster management initiatives. We need to strategize on how to proceed so that we can get the maximum support, blessings, and ownership from our private sector partners, while meeting their needs and requirements so that we can develop a sustainable relationship with them. When we are talking about developing a sustainable relationship, we have to be sensitive to their needs. We can engage them when the focus is to contribute to the survival or the continuity of their businesses. We need to create opportunities for them to be part of the decision making. If government could provide the proper legal framework and policies to meet, such as insurance requirements or safety standards, it would be easy to collaborate with the private sector. With that, thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatimath, and I think there's some really rich material in that. Can I ask you how you think that a program such as the one you have could be scaled up?
In order to scale up this type of initiatives, we firstly need a platform for sharing experiences in the region and for collaborating and sharing of technical resources to further develop and strengthen the program. We could link the programs in different countries, it will become more recognized regionally. That's one way. And the other way, I think, is we need to explore how we can expand the program to cover other industries and businesses. Because this program is focused on the resorts, the tourism sector itself. We need to strengthen the link between disaster management and business continuity in all sectors and services. I think that's the second way we could scale up the program. And one more I could suggest is we need to increase regional recognition of the program or international recognition of the program, because this is a local program and we are using local methods. If we can have a tool or something that could expand, that could give international standards to this program, I think that's the way to scale up the program. And this would pave way for promotion and marketing of their resorts and adopting international standardized qualification for the program. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I wonder on that note if perhaps we could move to you, Sandra. Could you pick up from there?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Gibson. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the private sector plays an important role in building the resilience of nations and communities. And in this complex, globalized world, neither the private sector nor the public sector can act alone. If the complex challenge of reducing the risk of hazards is to be effectively addressed. In response to this, UNISDR has been working with the private sector to build the resilience of the private sector and of society. In 2011, UNISDR developed 2 mechanisms to engage the private sector in its work. The Disaster Risk Reduction Private Sector Partnership, DRRPSP, consisting of nearly 70 companies, which includes 13 Asia companies, and the Private Sector Advisor Group, PSAG, acting as the steering committee of the PSP that has 4 Asian members. All members signed and committed to 2 key documents: the Statement of Commitment by the Private Sector for Disaster Prevention, Resilience, and Risk Reduction, and the Call for Action, 5 Essentials for Business in Disaster Risk Reduction. We do not just sit back and read newsletters and so on. We are actually organized into 5 working groups that support and advise UNISDR activities at the global, regional, and the national level to promote the DRR agendas in different programs and initiatives, such as Resilience Scorecard and RISE, and also consolidate private sector's input for the HFA2. I'm a chairperson and CEO of an engineering company that assists the local governments in disaster management planning and also resilience reconstruction. Our company is strong in survey and geospatial information, so we assist in central government through an emergency agreement with the Japanese Geospatial Information Authority to conduct emergency aerial photography when disaster occurs, and we are working with UNISDR. The private sector is diverse in size, in our industry sector, and what we are good at. And we are embedded in all parts of our country, from villages to towns to cities. We sincerely wish to create a safe and resilient society where the business operates. In other words, we are not doing this just for corporate social responsibility, although that is important, but also for our bottom line. The private sector partnership, together with other Asian private sector stakeholders, first drafted the voluntary commitment for this ministerial conference at the dedicated section at the preparatory meeting in April. We have debated it again for a full morning session on the 23rd, taking into account the globally emerging themes from private sector consultations around the world that took place in the past month. I wish now to tell you a bit about our stakeholders' commitment. We, the private sectors, understand the role we play and the responsibility we have to work with all stakeholders such as government, non-governmental organizations, and the civil society. Economies cannot exist without communities, and communities cannot exist without economies. and the private sector is, in most cases, the key driver for economy and social development within the community. With that understanding, our volunteer commitment specifies 3 actions. These are, first, improved collaboration of the private sector in DRR through partnerships. Second, increased knowledge and capacity in resilient business practices. Third, promote standards and reporting for resiliencies. At the practical level, this translates to actions such as, first, understanding key sectors that contribute to resilience, their current strength and weakness, and how they may be motivated to take action. Second, monitoring and coaching between larger and smaller enterprises to help SMEs toward resilient business practices in order to ensure the resilience of the global supply chain from the grassroots level. Third, making sure that other stakeholders understand the multiple ways of engaging with us through the sharing of good practices. Fourth, assisting governments in the better and clear communication of risk information. And the fifth, in general, keeping our communication clear and our toolkits practical and actionable. We will reach out to our governments and be proactive in opening dialogue. We hope to achieve mutual trust and inclusive input into policy making. Disaster directly affected business performance and undermine long-term competitiveness and sustainability with serious consequence for business, household, and the nation's prosperity. We need to reduce business failure as a result of disasters in order to ensure growth to community, economy, and the nation. Private sector can provide solutions for DRR through its core strength, its core business. Make it as business. Make it as a business case with the guidance under the framework. Therefore, we ask everyone, including governments, to consider how to fully and meaningfully engage in the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Michael, you and I were talking earlier on about the role of governments and the need for governments to build genuine partnerships with the private sector, and some of the challenges that go with that. I wonder if you could now perhaps lead off and get into some of those areas where you have such rich experience.
Thank you, Chair. I might just reflect on this issue about critical infrastructure or essential services. One of the things that we know from when disasters strike is that whatever the nature of the disaster, if the critical infrastructure keeps operating, the effect on the communities are to a very great extent reduced. If the power's still on, you can get drinking water from a tap, public transport operates, the shops are open, telecommunications, broadcasting, then there may be a lot of dislocation in the community, but the community will bounce back really quickly. Conversely, we also know that if those services are not there, whatever disruption has happened to the community will be many, many times worse, because people will be absolutely in fear for those essential requirements for life. Where do they get a meal? Where do they get shelter? How do they get to the hospital? How do they find out accurate information? And most of those utilities are in the hands of the private sector. If not in entirety, then in certainly key components of them. And so the work that we've been doing now for over 10 years is to sit down with the owners and operators of our critical infrastructure and engage them in the debate about how do we make the country more disaster resilient. And the first thing we found was that our definition wasn't big enough, that the utilities that we used to think of, power and water, we have to have the banks there. We need to have the cash. We need to have the teller machines. We need to have the machines that are in the supermarkets for people to pay for their food. We need to look at the food and grocery sector and the transport that underpins that. We need to talk about broadcasting. We need to talk about the telecommunications. So all of a sudden, our old-fashioned idea about essential services suddenly meant that we had 3 times as many business sectors to have to talk to. The other thing was that we'd made this assumption for many years that government understood how these systems worked. Well, what we found was government actually didn't know how they worked, and it was very hard to find one person who did. The complexity of these systems, their integration into global supply chains, the way that technology and the internet has now become a crucial part of the way even how the pharmaceuticals get to the hospital or the pharmaceuticals get to your local doctor or medical clinic. We didn't understand how integrated and how interdependent these sectors had become, that had happened very rapidly in our economy. So our ability to understand it was limited. Our ability to be able to intervene, the idea that government could somehow or other intervene in the middle of a crisis and take over the running of these sectors was really silly. These were extremely complex, and the expertise was in the business community. So whilst there was lots of laws that said government could tell business what to do in an emergency, actually that would have been the last thing we'd want to do. What we really want to do is get business back to business. We want to get business back to normal, running those essential services because they're the experts at doing it, not government. So getting these people around the table, getting the owners of the infrastructure, they said to us, look, we have a commercial incentive. We want our businesses back running too, but actually we need your help. We said, well, you need government's help. And they said, yeah, sometimes you don't let us through the cordon. You have a disaster, you evacuate the area, and then you expect everything to restore itself, but you won't let us back in. We actually need to be recognised that we're part of the recovery, that the private sector is actually part of the response to a disaster, whether it's about safeguarding the electricity grid from floodwaters so that things are not damaged, whether it's about getting the telephone system back in place, whether it's about putting portable emergency communications back in place to support commerce. So they said we need to be thought of as part of that first response. The other thing they said to us was we're part of a global supply chain. If we lose our submarine cables because of a storm or a ship dragging its anchor or because of a seismic event, we only control 1/2 of the cable. So we need to, for the government to engage with other governments about how do we restore shared infrastructure, and submarine cables is a great example of that. The other thing they said was sometimes we need to have plans that are bigger than one company. Maybe if it's an electricity company in one city, you may need to have mutual aid arrangements where you can borrow equipment or borrow technicians from another. And then that raises questions about whether they're licensed to do it, whether there are particular rules that government has that will prevent people from being able to move their staff around or move their equipment around. So what we found was that once we got the conversation started, we found that there were very clear suggestions for government about what we could do, and sometimes it was for us to get out of the way and actually let business get back to business. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Michael. And again, there was some extremely rich material there about the approach of governments and most particularly the limitations that you spelled out. And I couldn't help also but thinking how dependent we are today on certain areas of technology, I have no idea how now I could function without I was going to say an iPhone, but it could be a Samsung or whatever, and all the applications, be it banking, payments, whatever. So that was extremely rich. But can we now move actually to what is the private sector's role in building resilience? We've heard about the government, we've heard some of the international dimensions, but the private sector itself. Annie, if you could address this, and how do you think the role of the private sector could be expanded?
Excellencies, Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of SM Prime Holdings, I wish to extend our deep gratitude to the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, specifically to Ms. Margaretha Wallstrom and her team, and also to Ms. Sandra Wu, the chairperson of the Private Sector Advisory Group, for their tireless efforts and synergistic approach to disaster risk reduction, and for acknowledging the vital role of private sector's participation in disaster resilience. It opened our eyes to doing work not only on piecemeal basis, but rather to do things on a more purposive basis at national levels in the standard of global initiatives. We are here today to stand up and to be counted. Known to the world that through on-ground and accurate reporting, CNN and BBC and numerous other media channels, on September 2013, the Philippines was struck with a 7.2 magnitude earthquake. And on November 8, it was followed by Category 3 Typhoon Haiyan that hit the central part of the country, ravaging numerous coastal towns of Tacloban and many more. And based on the records of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council of the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan affected 16 million Filipino people, with 1.1 million houses damaged and a death toll at 6,200. What then is the role of private sector in building disaster resilience, and how can this be expanded? In brief, our company SM Prime serves as one of the largest mall developers and operators in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. We operate 49 malls in the country and 5 more in China. And across the Philippine malls, we receive 3.8 million people in our properties daily. And it is precisely because of this that we have great interest in disaster preparedness and in safeguarding our business continuity. We have identified and worked on 3 priority areas, but we are not limited to these alone. We do advocacies on information, education, and communication. We also share our best practices, and we do invest in infrastructures. SM recognizes the impact of climate change and have started to incorporate disaster preparedness, business continuity programs, and risk reduction and resilience in how we operate our businesses. In 2009, our early initiatives included our Green Film Festival. We have invited over 470,000 public school children who have absolutely no access to said material on climate change, and the interested public into our communities. They were provided free film showings of climate change and the havocs its disaster. In June 2010, we invited former US Vice President Al Gore to speak to numerous 5,000 audience on climate change. In cooperation now with UNISDR, SM Prime provided a platform for business owners to openly discuss disaster risk reduction through our Top Leaders Forum, now held yearly in Manila. The first Top Leaders Forum was in 2012 with the theme Building an Asian Private Partnership to make corporations safer against disaster. Last year, our theme was Incentives for Disaster Resilience. We had CEOs and business leaders participating in this forum to discuss risk insurance and risk financing. And just last week, SM Prime, together with UNISDR Global Education and Training, involved our partner tenants and brought more pressing environmental disaster issues to their attention. So there are many things that private sector does. We've also done our share of investments in infrastructures. Way back in 2004, disaster resilient features were done in our malls. We featured water containment basins built underneath our malls surrounding flood-prone communities, so much so that when there was typhoon, water flowed into these water containment basins instead of flooding the communities. Another investment in infrastructure that we have done was having built a mall on supportive stilts. That is 20.5 meters above ground after having studied the 100-year flood cycle of the area beside the river. By this way, we are doing our disaster preparedness. One of our other bigger malls is called the Mall of Asia. This mall was built 4.5 meters above sea level, a full 1.5 meters above the building compliance. Disaster resilience has now become an investment cost rather than an expense. In 2009, while major portions of Manila remained flooded, the Mall of Asia was spared precisely because of this investment in infrastructure. In 2013, SM Supermalls began discussions on the need for risk insurance against natural disasters, especially for the small and medium enterprises. Businesses need incentives from insurance companies so that businesses can invest in resilience building infrastructures and innovations. And this, we believe, would spur changes in interest in a larger way with other private sector companies. But what else can private sector do to enable communities to recover from disasters? We can all do our share, align our efforts with government, and move on. After Typhoon Haiyan, led by private sector SM Prime led the private sector to rebuild communities, offering 1,000 disaster-resilient homes for the victims in support to Build Back Better program of our government. SM spoke to all of its suppliers and shareholders to participate in this effort, and to date, over 1,500 private sector companies have joined hands with us. We in the private sector would like to contribute to the global risk reduction dialogue towards positive change. We hope to continue this collaboration towards raising awareness and to influence people and communities to push for policies and structures and systems that foster a more cohesive response to disaster risk reduction. We are fully aware that the collective inputs and participation from the members of this plenary will help shape future policies on disaster risk management in collaboration with private sector. Let me end my presentation with a quote from Ms. Margaretha Wallstrom during the second Top Leaders Forum in Manila last November 2013. I quote, "No country, no government, no civil society on its own will be able to manage, to reduce risks, and to strengthen resilience. It takes the engagement by business and the private sector." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. And I must say personally, I was very taken with the assistance that you as a major operation are providing to small and medium enterprises. One of the experiences for New Zealand at the time of the Christchurch earthquake was some 95% of the businesses affected in Christchurch were small and medium enterprises. Fortunately, we did have some private sector leadership at the time that worked with the government, and I think this was mentioned in the earlier technical session, which enabled essentially business to keep going with scarcely a blip. Another big issue in Christchurch was insurance. Happily, we were a very heavily insured environment. It's also a very complex area, and Gail, may I now lead into you and invite you to address what is a very, very important subject.
Thank you, Chair, dear moderators, excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I believe the first step towards engagement is the recognition of the issue. So we had many discussions, conferences over the past months and years, and I believe today there is a strong recognition that disaster risk is significant and is increasing both in severity and in frequency. Severity. Only last year, natural catastrophe generated economic losses amounting 2% of the worldwide GDP. Frequency. Over the past 30 years, the number of events impacting Asia have been multiplied by 3. So this is extremely significant and impacting the development of our economies in Asia. It impacts also a significant number of people. A number of people are impacted through, I would say, categoric events, death, through floods, tsunamis, drought. There are also a number of people who are impacted by natural catastrophe and who need to displace themselves to avoid those impacts. And this is estimated to be 30 million people per year impacted by natural catastrophe who have to displace themselves, which is roughly the same number as people impacted by war, terrorism, riots across the world. So it's extremely significant. And 90% of those 30 million people are based in Asia. The other element which is increasing our awareness and recognition of the issue is the difference between economic losses, which for the year 2013 worldwide were in the vicinity of 130 billion US dollar, the difference between those economic losses and the amount of insured losses, which represented less than 30% of the economic losses. Meaning, in terms of who is paying the economic impact, it is not only the insurance companies, it is in the end the citizens in the various countries who have to rebuild their houses, who have to rebuild their lives impacted by natural catastrophes. We have in Asia a very low insurance penetration. It is improving in line with the development of our economic societies, but it is still very low. And when you look at the impact of natural catastrophes in Asia, having a low insurance penetration is slowing down the resolution of the issue as well. So insurance has a key role to play, definitely, and we want to play that role. But given the significance of the issue, we will be efficient and effective if we can coordinate our efforts and our solutions with the stakeholders at large, be them the governments, the regulators, the customers, the corporate businesses. So what are the actions that insurance companies have started to take and which are important to reduce the impact of disaster risk? I will mention 4. The first one is a better understanding of the risk and a better awareness of the risk. At AXA, we have started 7 years ago to invest significantly into fundamental research to better understand risk and to share that research openly. It is now more than 30 million euros that we have invested to support fundamental research towards natural catastrophe, be it pollution, natural hazard, urban resilience, all those themes which are very close to disaster risk. 30 million euros, which help to develop the knowledge over risk and to better share the knowledge over risk. So risk understanding is the first action that we can take. Risk prevention is the second action that we can take. In all the countries where we operate, we have entities which are taking preventive actions towards their customers to educate on risk, and to share what type of preventive actions can be implemented. We have also done an agreement and a partnership with organizations which are very well anchored into local communities, CARE being an example of it, with whom we have made a partnership over the past 2 years, which we have renewed for 2 years. And thanks to this partnership, we have been able to support 600,000 beneficiaries across the world, and we intend to double those number of beneficiaries over the next 2 years. Through this partnership, having a partnership between an NGO and an institution, an insurance company, we have been able to support CARE into getting additional financing support into their actions, to the amount of 3 million euros over the past 2 years. With those actions, both in our hands through our own entities, but also through partnerships with local organizations or locally anchored organizations, we can develop preventive actions towards our customers. Customers being both individuals, but also, and that is extremely important, SMEs and the actions they can take in their BCPs, their business continuity plans. So risk prevention is the second key action that we are taking. The third one is about risk reduction. It's about designing the appropriate products, the appropriate solutions to develop protections for our customers against disaster risk. It's about shaping the insurance solutions towards more sustainable solutions like green energy or sustainable investment. The fourth pillar and the fourth action that we are taking is about risk financing. And this is also a very important one, because insurance business is the only business which has an inverted cycle. We get the money first, and we'll deliver the service sometimes long after. Which means we need to be up to this commitment that we are going to pay the claims when claims occur. Which means we need to have the level of solvency which will allow us to pay the claims when claims occur. So our ability to manage our capital in a sound and a healthy manner, our ability to invest our assets in a sound and healthy manner, our ability to take the appropriate reinsurance solutions, be it through reinsurers, but also through risk financing solutions that we can find today on the financial markets. Those three elements are extremely important to allow an insurance company for appropriate risk financing. So risk education, awareness, knowledge, risk prevention, risk reduction, and risk financing are the four key actions that we, AXA, we have started to take. And I must say, most of the insurance players have started to take also those actions, and they are extremely important to continue to contribute to disaster risk reduction. But I would agree with Annie, the only action of the insurance companies will not be enough, because we are talking about very significant risk, and we need to take coordinated and concerted actions with all the stakeholders, including the regulators, including the governments, including the corporate businesses, the private sectors, and including the individual citizens. Because it's only when we will have a shared knowledge of the issue and a shared willingness to engage that we will be able to really make a difference for the long term. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward for the actions that we are all going to commit for Sendai in April next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for covering what is such a complex area in a way that certainly I, for one, found it relatively easy to understand. One of the characteristics of Margarita Wallström's chairmanship or moderation is that she always wants to keep things action-focused. And so, with that in mind, I would like now to challenge the members sitting here at the table with a question. And I'm going to ask you to answer it as much as you can within one line. And that question is, in one line, what needs to happen in the next 2 years to better enable the private sector to reduce disaster risk? I'm arbitrarily going to start, if you don't mind, with Ms. Annie Garcia. Annie?
Well, over the next 2 years, I would like to think that by that time, all of our 15,000 stakeholders or our tenants would have well established their business continuity plans and are engaged with us or with their own respective communities on disaster preparedness. It cannot just remain in the walls of the malls. It has to go out into the communities where we are all situated in. And with that, I believe we can have better prepared people and communities to be able to save lives and to continue on with business as soon as possible to get livelihood back to everyone.
Thank you very much. Michael Rothery.
I think this works. I'm on air. Well, I'd like to see the various governments sit down with the owners of their essential infrastructure and have really full and frank discussions about their vulnerabilities, the complexities of their supply chain, but also the interdependence between the sectors.
Thank you for that. And Sandra, Ms. Sandra Wu, may I turn to you?
Yes. I would like to see, in the coming 2 years, increase the engagement of the private sector on the DRR, and also create a mechanism on DRR through this PPP, the public-private partnership. And the second I would like to see is for the private sector itself, from the big organization to the local SME, together as a global supply chain to create a more strong and more resilient global supply chain, not just only by company, the business continuity plan, by the whole industry and by whole supply chain.
Thank you. Deputy Minister Fatimath.
Thank you. I think the national governments have a huge role as a regulator to contribute to this question. I think in the next 2 years, I would like to see that we create a platform for private sector to not only contribute, but a platform for advocacy, awareness, and sensitization on their role to protect themselves, integrate risk reduction into business planning, designing from the very inception of the businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. And Gail Olivier.
Thank you. And the beauty to have extremely competent moderators and to speak last is that everything has been said, and I would echo all of what you have said. I would just add one thing. I believe risk is an intrinsic element of our societies, and it is a sign of development of our societies. So I would like all of us in the future to take an active and positive stance towards risk and transform risk into opportunities through appropriate measures to reduce the impact, the negative impact of risk.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, because we are a little bit ahead of time, and I should explain the reason why we are a little bit ahead of time. is some of us sitting here have lived in Japan, and some do live in Japan. And we have experience of how punctual and punctilious Japanese society is in terms of managing everything, including meetings. So our wish to be on time is out of due deference to you and the role that you're going to be playing in Sendai. Having said that, I know that we do have a couple of minutes, and so I want to make a concluding remark in respect to that final question: what needs to happen in the next 2 years? And the remark I'm going to make draws from our own experience 3 years back in terms of a devastating earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand's second largest city, and an earthquake from which it will take us some decades probably to recover. There have been 13,000 aftershocks. What did we find was probably the most important thing in terms of ensuring social resilience at the time, after that immediate horror of the first 2 or 3 days? It was about families going to bed at night, often in broken homes, but it was about kids getting up in the morning and going to school, and it was about mum and dad getting up in the morning and going to work. And I think that's something very fundamental that we have to remember, because business resilience is about mums and dads getting up, going to work, and providing a normalcy of life. Business resilience is fundamental too, and essentially the same as community resilience. Mr. Chairman, I now deliver the floor back to you, but I would like to thank all of my colleagues for their rich and timely interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gibson, for the excellent moderation, for the very rich discussion we had. I thank you also, all the panelists, for the intervention. And I also thank for the efficient management of time. We started about half an hour later than predicted, but we are even ahead of time to be able to finish by 6 o'clock. We have another 5 or 6 minutes for intervention from the floor about the discussion we had. I would like to invite comments, questions. May I encourage first country representative to comments, and then I will proceed with other participants to comments. Please state the country or organization and the name before you take the floor. So the floor is open. Please have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Charles Bourbion from the OECD High-Level Risk Forum. And I wanted just to strongly echo the remark from Assistant Secretary Michael Rotary from Australia. The sector of critical infrastructures requires, we believe at the OECD, a specific attention to strengthen resilience, as these networks and their interconnectedness are the key channels through which disasters impacts cascade and complexity arise, maybe more in fact than the supply chains themselves. So there are key questions for sector regulators to address here. Is there a need for more stringent regulations for these sectors? Should there be more robust systems, or should there be more redundant ones? How to foster business continuity and mutual aid agreements in these sectors? And most importantly, who should bear the costs? So these are just few questions I wanted to highlight. The OECD High-Level Risk Forum is currently working on in partnership with the private sector, and we will be happy to contribute further to your reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I will invite several comments before I invite the panelists to react. Are there other comments or questions? Okay, if not, Michael, are you ready to react on the question? You have the floor.
It's a very popular microphone. I think there's only the one. Thanks, Charles, for that. For those questions. They were rhetorical questions, or you want me to answer them for you? Look, I think there are very different business cultures and governance cultures in different economies, I think the general observation that we're making is that we are trying to have a smaller regulatory input or footprint on the utility sector and move to more of a market-based solution. What that does is it gives you, there's a trade-off of risks. It means that you are dependent upon the operators taking a long-term view. And that long-term view has to include their reputation in the marketplace, so that they want to protect the brand. Where the risk then emerges is in monopoly sectors, such as in transmission, so power transmission, which are quite often virtually monopolies that are regulated. And in those cases, it is necessary for regulators to be involved in setting the guidance about the standards for reliability. But what we find in other sectors, in telecommunications and banking, is that there is a predisposition, a positive predisposition by company managers to act to protect brand and reputation in the marketplace. But sometimes they themselves are not aware of some of the risks. So some of those complexities are opaque. They're difficult to see, and they can be described in engineering terms, which can be difficult for senior executives to really understand. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is effectively working with those who understand the complexities, but to try and communicate the messages in a way that senior executives and their customers, because some of it's got to be driven by customer demand. So this is, I think the approach has to be tailored to the business culture in each economy, and also to the government's predisposition to regulate. The one note of caution I would say is regulating very technically complex sectors means that the likelihood that you get the regulation absolutely right is remote. And it has to be agile, it has to allow for innovation, it has to allow for technological advancement, and therefore what we're tending to do is, where we do regulate, we're going to principles-based regulation rather than very technically specific regulation. I don't know if that helps with the answer there, Charles.
Thank you. Michael. I see one more comment, more hand raised there. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Loy from India. Two quick questions. One is, how successful have we been in mobilizing national associations of of industry or chambers of commerce? Because we have not yet heard their voice in this particular regional platform. So any experiences from any countries? I know there have been rich experiences from several, but we'd like to hear more about it. The other thing, so that's one question. I want to switch tracks to a proposal that was there in the key elements paper, and that is there in the original international strategy, which is to bring technological hazards under the regime of HFA2. It's a proposal from 15 years ago when we enunciated the ISDR at the end of the decade for natural disaster reduction and said we must now fix all hazards. But the reality was HFA1 covered much less. So HFA2 has a very distinct proposal. I'd like to hear some reactions from industry on what they think about it. Because after all, we are facing the 30th anniversary of Bhopal, the 40th anniversary of Flixborough, this very year itself. And it's the right time to raise this question 4 years after Fukushima, when we are meeting in Sendai.
Thank you for your questions. Okay, Ms. Sandra, who is willing to answer on the first part? Yes, please, Ms. Sandra.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we do have collaboration with the international chamber, and through them we go down to the regional and the national level. We are working on that, and not just only working together with the chamber associate, but we also through our private sector group. We have the UNISDR, the regional office, and UNISDR also hold the regional platform. And every time we will invite the regional private sector group partners to participate in the platform. And also, under the same UN family, we are trying to work closely with the UN Global Compact company from the headquarters, Global Wild, as well as the national network as well. And we're also approaching the World Economic Forum. They have the disaster reduction partnership and the catastrophe initiatives. There are all those possibilities for those private sectors network that we can, expand the channel. We'll try our best. Most important thing is to increase awareness among the private sector. At the same time, and make sure there's a private sector focal point to give the voice in the local community.
Thank you, Ms. Wu. Who'd like to react on the, I forgot the wording you used. I think you meant the kind of technological hazard, industrial accident, etc. Anyone willing to react on that?
Okay. Sorry, it's from the private sector perspective. For all those technology one, yes, UNISDR, they also have the Science and Technology Advisory Group to provide support and the advice on how to adopt and utilizing the more innovative the science and the technology and the research. And I'm not talking about just only those information management or the information communication. At the same time, for example, like AXA, they just launched a AXA Research Fund. They were helping to encourage or to improve those the science and the technology innovation. Hope that answers your question.
more reaction on industrial accident. So. Okay, well, I will have to conclude the meeting. It's 2 minutes before 6, according to my time. I don't know if I need to summarize everything which was said. As you have heard, we had a very rich discussion, which essentially all points to the fact that the private sector, we don't really need to talk about partnership with private sector, because the private sector is an essential part of the solution, of the reaction to this disaster risk reduction exercise. And we started from the example of PPP in the Maldives, in the resorts. And then we have heard that already the private sector is very much involved in the discussion of the ISDR through Ms. Sandra Wu. And then we realized that governments have to come out of the traditional thinking and have a much more thorough discussion with the private sector, which is actually the part of the solution. They know what to do and have their cooperation and increase information sharing. We also heard that from Annie that actually disaster risk reduction makes sense, is a business, is a good business decision, and the importance to have the continuity business plan in place for the business itself. And we have heard also the important role of the insurance and risk financing, DRR, and how the insurance community is working on risk prevention, risk reduction, and risk financing, in addition to information sharing and education. We have also heard the one-line recommendation, and my impression was that it all pointed to the same thing again, to the importance that all business should be fully involved in the disaster risk reduction business, I would say, and be working much more closely with all actors to that end. So with that, I wish to conclude the session. I have not summarized everything, but I will assure you that all of the things that has been said here will be considered in Sendai. So those who feel a bit frustrated for my summary, please come to Sendai and please contribute to the HFA2 discussion. Thank you.